So I had an interaction with Joanne over this extremely silly and emotional, cloying article that appeared on NBC News, nightly news with Lester Holt. And it was about climate change, and the the premise is climate grief, the growing emotional toll of climate change. So it says that the increasing visibility of climate change combined with bleak scientific reports and rising carbon dioxide emissions is taking a toll on mental health, experts say, especially among young people who are increasingly losing hope for the future. And it comes with this picture of a couple from behind staring at the at two mountains that are burning down. Apparently, I guess it's fires in California or something. Yeah, so this is a news story, right? That apparently people can't handle hearing these endless stories about how we're all going to die from climate change, and if we don't let Justin Trudeau and Angela Merkel do what they want to do, then there's something terribly wrong with you, apparently. But yeah, I mean, what a surprise, if you bombard people with this constant messaging that is appealing to their fears and appealing to their emotions, you get people responding emotionally and with fear. So anyway, fortunately, a lot of people commenting on this article were critical of it. They were kind of making fun of this idea that people are too emotionally distraught and can't handle these reports. So Joanne was very critical of those people. She wrote, "Far too many people commenting below seem to have missed the fact that there is no longer a debate on the science behind climate change or its causes. Did you miss that every single leader and country in the world knows the science and have been meeting on this? Did you miss the fact that the respected climatologists at NASA and the Union is Concerned Scientists, etc., are no longer writing about climate science, but about how bad will we allow this to get and the different scenarios we may see if we don't do something quickly? The world has left you behind, just like those in the Flat Earth Society. You now look ridiculous and ignorant." So this is why these rebuttals of the week can be useful, because you get to see the form of reasoning and thinking about these issues that are out there. This is very standard. Right, so what you're getting from Joanne here is the narrative, right? She's a vehicle for the narrative. She's not demonstrating she knows anything about this, other than that she's been, like the rest of us, bombarded with the messaging for 10, 15 years, whatever it is, and that she is declaring that anybody who doesn't express conformity to that messaging, who questions it in any way, is ridiculous and ignorant. And so she makes these kind of statements like the fact that there is no longer a debate on the science behind climate change or its causes. That is not a fact. That is factually incorrect. But Joanne is convinced that she's right about this. So I responded to Joanne by saying this: "Did you miss the fact that appeal to authority is a logical fallacy and only demonstrates the incompetence of one's reasoning? All the politicians are telling us that they can control the temperature of the planet by 0.3 of 1 degree 8 decades from now. You'd have to be ridiculous and ignorant not to believe them." To which Joanne responds, "All of the politicians are not telling us about climate change. Leading, highly respected climatologists are. Plus, those of us who are older are seeing it change in our lifetimes." What does that mean? Those of us, like, that's an argument? Those of us who are older all think the same thing about this. "As they've said, climate change is supposed to change very slowly. You'd have to be delusional and pretty darn ridiculous not to listen to them." So, again, it's these kinds of assertions, these truth claims, these claims that are presented as absolute facts, that like climate is supposed to change very slowly. So I think people like Joanne, people who represent these kind of generic interpretations, they think they know what they're talking about. But I think what's happened is that they take that familiarity with the general narrative, that's sort of out there in the ether that we all are familiar with, and they extrapolate from that these very specific points and beliefs that aren't necessarily true at all, but they convince themselves that they're true. So, climate's supposed to change very slowly. According to whom? And what does very slowly mean? And how does Joanne know how climate's supposed to change? She doesn't. So I responded, well, first of all, you don't speak for those of us who are older. And secondly, some climatologists may be saying what you are claiming, others are not. And who says climate is supposed to change one way or the other? It's pretty obvious that you don't know what you're talking about. So she comes back and she says, sorry again, you are wrong. The debate on climate change is over. Again, another definitive statement. I know for a fact that the debate on climate change is over. I'm that well informed about this that I can make that definitive statement. If you read the reports now, do you read? The issues are the different scenarios of disaster that we may see. So her thing is that we don't even discuss the actual science anymore. It's just about this latest report from the IPCC saying that we're all going to die even worse than they said we would die the last 5 or 6 times they were claiming we were all going to die within 20 years. Again, there is no debate among legitimate, respected climatologists about climate change, period. Find a new source for your news and information. You are being had, right? You are being had. Couldn't possibly be that it's the person who has unquestioningly and uncritically accepted and internalized the messaging that has been broadcast at us relentlessly for over a decade, the single perspective, the single interpretation that has been spoon-fed to us, which we're told that any questioning of that perspective, any critical scrutiny of it, any doubt directed towards it, makes you, as Joanne has said, ignorant and ridiculous by definition. Couldn't possibly be that it's the person who has absorbed and accepted that messaging who has been had, right? You think that question ever occurred to Joanne? I don't think so. So what happened next was, of course, is that Joanne provided me with a cascade of links to websites and articles and videos, all sorts of things on the internet, because this is another example of the style of thinking out there, of the way people put their worldview together. And rather than thinking for themselves, people have learned to fob off thinking to the internet. So what they do instead is that they adopt these generic opinions, these pre-packaged, ready-to-go generic opinions. What am I supposed to think about climate change? Okay, that's what I'll think. What am I supposed to think about transgenderism? Okay, that's what I'll think about that. What am I supposed to think about toxic masculinity? Okay, that's what I'll think about that. And then when they are put in a position to justify their generic opinions, since they don't have any sort of lineage for these opinions, they didn't cultivate these opinions themselves through their own independent critical thinking and scrutiny and weighing different perspectives to come up at the end of that process with a specific way of viewing the world or conclusion. They didn't do any of that. They simply adopted these opinions whole cloth, and so when they have to justify them, they simply direct you to the internet. Right? My thinking is in the internet. It's like all the thinking's been done in there, so it's your responsibility to go off and read this article or watch this video that I've linked to, which they haven't read and they haven't watched. They've simply Googled something to go, oh, look, this proves I'm right. So this is what it's come to. This is what these people genuinely think is credible, a credible form of argument. So I present Joanne with a series of quotes from a list of world-class, highly credentialed scientists, experts in the field of climate and climate change that I've culled from the 3 books on the subject I've read, and all of whom take issue to varying degrees with the catastrophic CO2-driven man-made climate change premise. Many of them are also very critical of the institutions which have become the climate change establishment, criticizing their methods, their conclusions, and the politics involved with the man-made climate change narrative and promoting it. So how does Joanne respond to seeing this? Because basically I've proven that her assertions are wrong. They're clearly, objectively wrong. By extension, that proves that her perception of this issue is distorted and wrong. And by further extension, it shows that her assumption that of her own brilliance in comparison to everybody that she's attacking here is also misguided. So how does she respond? Well, she responds in the way that people who represent these generic opinions always respond. She falls back on relying on slogans and generic labels which she applies. So in other words, she defaults to labeling all of these people who I've quoted as deniers. And so this is the kind of circular reasoning that you see from people like this all of the time, and it's what to look out for when you're engaging with these people, right? So she makes an assertion that there are no credible, legitimate climate scientists out there who don't agree with the perspective that I'm putting forth. And then I say, well, here's a bunch that don't agree with you. And her response is, well, those are deniers, therefore they don't count. Right? So it's this impulse not to grapple with reality or truth or to find what's really going on, but rather to protect conclusions that they are attached to. And so you have to generate justifications to exclude anything that threatens that conclusion, right? And that's what this whole, they're deniers, therefore I declare them not legitimate or something. And then, of course, she brought out the slogan of 97% scientists, right? This slogan. It's a slogan, and slogans aren't arguments. But this is another thing that people like Joanne, people who represent these generic opinions, this is what they do. And again, it's about externalizing the thinking process, like something else is doing the thinking for me. So they rely on these slogans because they sort of treat them as if the argument's already been made and it's contained within the slogan. Like everything that needs to be said is all encapsulated in that set of words. So I just have to invoke the magic words, and that makes my argument for me and proves that I'm right somehow. So I kind of explain all of this to Joanne, and I make this point. I say, at no point have you demonstrated any genuine personal insight about the subject. Now, Joanne's response to this issue of personal insight is fascinating, and it's very revealing, not only of Joanne's mindset, but I think it speaks to the mindset of people in general who do this same thing that Joanne does, is like making themselves a vehicle for these generic, fashionable opinions. So she says, personal insights? I'm not a climatologist. Your personal insights are meaningless. Right? It's the high priests have declared what is true. They are the truth givers, and your job is to simply accept it, internalize it, and treat it as unquestionable absolute truth. So I kind of take it upon myself to explain what personal insight means and why, as a responsible thinking adult, you're kind of obliged to engage the process of cultivating personal insight on every subject. So I say, personal insight means you have taken information and messaging that has been delivered to you and you integrate it by actively applying reasoning and critical scrutiny to it, so you end up with informed personal discernment about the subject. That's the opposite of what you are demonstrating and in fact championing here, which is to passively absorb information and messaging that is delivered to you and to regurgitate it on cue as your own opinion and as absolute truth, which is literally the description of someone who has been thoroughly propagandized. Right? So the mistake that people like Joanne make here is that they assume that someone like me is claiming to know climate science better than climate scientists, which is ironic because I'm the one saying neither of us know climate science. So what we have to do is discern the information that's coming at us. We have to be able to kind of process this and to scrutinize it and to figure out what we're being told and if it's true and to what degree. And it's actually people like Joanne who are claiming to be able to speak for climate scientists. They're the ones saying, I know the science. And in fact, that's the next thing that gets addressed here, because she responds to me trying to describe the necessity of personal insight like this. This is what she writes. So where have your personal insights been published? What did you say your work background is? And I think what happens is that people like this, people like Joanne, climate change conformists, they conflate the narrative. They conflate knowing the narrative with the science, right? They think it's the same thing. And they conflate the narrative with objective truth. And so anything other than conforming to the narrative is against the science. Oh, you think you know more than the scientists. And it's, no, you think that the narrative tells you everything you need to know about what every important scientist and expert thinks about this. That's the issue. So I tried to explain this to Joanne by saying this. So the entire point is that genuine insight by autonomous thinking adults doesn't need to be published to be valid. You are evidencing the worldview of a child in kindergarten. The teacher said so, and that's all there is to it. The irony with people who represent the thinking you are representing here is that you are the one claiming to know the science. You are the one claiming to be qualified to speak on behalf of all legitimate, respected climatologists. You are the one claiming to be in possession of absolute truth, not me. So if there's anyone who should have the pompous, where have your ideas been published question directed at them, it's you. And then at this point, it's where the whole thing kind of ground to a sudden halt. Joanne responded by going, OMG, are you still commenting? I quit reading long ago. You really need to take your mental masturbation elsewhere. Mental masturbation? Why do you waste your time this way? Do you not have nothing better to do? It's like, so you've been doing this the whole time that I've been doing this, and all of a sudden it's a waste of time, but only on my behalf, right? So, and then of course she finishes by ignoring the fact that we've had this long debate, ignoring the fact that she's made these assertions which have been completely refuted, ignoring the fact that she hasn't been able to substantiate any of her claims or make a proper argument, and simply reasserting the same assertions. Climate change is real. Well, nobody was arguing whether climate change is real or not. Climate changes. It's going to threaten life on this planet. Really? You don't know that. So, and you didn't establish that. Far from it. Go away and take your mental masturbation elsewhere. What's with the mental masturbation? She's really kind of hung up on that. And then goodbye and little emoji of hands waving or clapping or something. So that's what you get, right? So you get this all of the time. You get these sanctimonious, self-righteous, self-aggrandizing people who proclaim that their perspective on this is 100% true, is absolutely perfect, that anybody who doesn't agree with them, who doesn't conform to the perspective that they're representing, is ignorant and ridiculous and a fool and stupider than me. And then you question them and you point out the flaws in their comments and in their arguments, and they can't do anything to refute those criticisms. And in the end, they just get in a huff and say, I'm taking my ball and leaving, and they go, I'm right and you're wrong because I say so and you're a jerk.
This is going to get ugly.
Never okay